Hello, my name is Avery Szakacs, and my presentation is on the Greco-Roman influence on Buddhist art and how this really paved the way for future pictorial depictions of the Buddha. When discussing Buddhism, it is impossible not to acknowledge the rich amount of art created within the Buddhist tradition. When one thinks of Buddhist art, they are more than likely met with an image of a jolly plump man or maybe an elegant stoic statue of Siddhartha Gautama. But where did this tradition start? How is there such vastness in the depictions of the Buddha when early Indian Buddhist art practically never depicted an anthropomorphic Buddha? The answers to these questions is found in the merging of Greco-Roman and Indian cultures with the invasion of Alexander the Great into India in the 4th century BCE. Before we look at the impact Greco-Roman culture had on Buddhist art, it is essential to look at examples of Buddhist art pre-Greek invasion to truly understand the vastness by which it was transformed. While the Buddha is believed to have lived in the 5th century BCE, it was not until nearly 300 years later when Buddhist art truly started to emerge in India. This emergence of Buddhist art in India can be attributed to the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka's rule in India, who swore to peacefully spread Buddhism after seeing the horrors of war. The most revered piece of art made under Ashoka's rule is the architectural piece of the Great Stupa, built to house the Buddha's ashes. Cosmic influences are clear in the intricate carvings on the stupa, along with the stupa shape itself. The base of the building is composed of a dome that is impenetrable. Buddhists walk clockwise around the dome, following the sun mandala, or the model of the universe. 4 stone gateways face the 4 cardinal directions and separate the sacred site from everyday life. The gateways have carvings from the Buddha's life story and represent the cosmos. While the gateways have clear depictions of the Buddha's life, there is not one single anthropomorphic representation of him. He is instead represented through aniconic symbols, such as a horse without a rider, the Bodhi tree, or his footprints. This is because in the Buddhist tradition, pictorial representations of the Buddha are believed to harbor the Buddha's presence itself. Artworks depicting the Buddha are not seen as merely a portrait, but rather an actual embodiment of the Buddha. The influence of Indian culture is very evident in every aspect of this stupa. The dome shape of the mound reflects the importance of astrology in Indian culture, and the lack of representation of the Buddha himself is inherently a part of Indian culture. The major shift from aniconic to iconic representations of the Buddha can be seen in the merging of Greco-Roman and Indian cultures after the conquest of the Indus River Basin by Alexander the Great in 330 BCE. Previous Indian artworks of non-representational art began to mix with stylistic conventions of Hellenistic art. Hellenistic art relied heavily on naturalistic idealization, or creating an image with representations of cultural ideals of perfection. Looking at the sculpture of Dorophorus on the left, you can see the implications of these idealistic views. While the statue is lifelike and relatively realistic, it is made to be the idealized version of a Roman citizen through the presentation of symmetry, youth, and fitness. Previous Indian artworks were not nearly as naturalistic, such as the sculpture Shalabanchika Yakshi of the Great Stupa. The sculpted figure is much more stylized, with not too much detail on the body. While the figure is anatomically correct, there is not much detail in terms of muscle definition or aspects that would make the figure look as though it is alive. It looks like a depiction of something rather than a lifelike imitation, which is exactly what it is. A great way to discern naturalistic and non-naturalistic art is to look at the hands and feet of any given artwork. When looking at the Shalabanchika Yakshi sculpture, the feet are much more blocky and give off the impression of a stylized depiction. With Dorophorus, you can practically see the underlying anatomical structures of the foot carved into the surface of the marble. It makes sense that Indian art pre-Greek invasion was fairly non-representational, as that is what was prevalent within the culture. The symbolism of something was more important than a literal depiction. This is seen all throughout the Great Stupa, with the Buddha being represented through symbols and not a literal replication. A culture's art is in fact a product of that culture, and that art in turn continues to influence the culture. After a couple hundred years of assimilation into Greco-Roman culture, the ancient region of Gandhara, now located in modern-day Pakistan, became a stronghold for Greco-Buddhist art. The belief in the presence of the Buddha within pictorial representations started to fade as Indian and Roman cultures began to merge. The Hellenistic influence on Buddhist art is clear in this Gandharian Buddha statue from the 1st century CE. The ropes draped over the Buddha's body have been carved to reveal the anatomical form underneath, creating a beautiful illusion of transparency despite the solid nature of the sculpture. This contrasts greatly with the Shalabanchika Yakshi sculpture, where the depiction of clothing was done through the carving of flat lines into the stone, versus reliance on light and shadow to create depth. The hair of the sculpture has been adorned with waves, closely resembling the texture of hair given to many Greek and Roman sculptures. Again, looking at the Shalabanchika Yakshi sculpture, we can see that the hair is a single mass of stone with relatively no detailing. Adding these varying amounts of depths within the Gandhara statue adds shadow, making the form feel more three-dimensional, more lifelike, and therefore more naturalistic. Not all of the beauty from the Indian tradition has been lost within this artwork, though. The face of the Buddha, while still fairly naturalistic, has larger stylized eyes and a strong connection from the brow bone to the nose. There's also a cranial bump present on the statue, an Indian symbol of heightened spiritual powers. While the hands and feet are more defined, they are still stylized in a more random manner, echoing older Indian artworks. An incredible physical manifestation of Western and Eastern traditions can be seen in the hands of this sculpture. The figure's right hand has been damaged, but it can be safely assumed that the raised stance of the arm and the fact that it is the figure's right arm, that the hand formed a mudra. While it is impossible to know which mudra gesture the sculpture had, the fact still remains there is a clear Indian influence within the positioning of this arm. The figure's left arm is seen in a relaxed position, a feature commonly seen in idealistic Greco-Roman statues. We have this depiction of a central Indian figure made in a region occupied by Rome, with clear influences from both cultures just from the arms alone. It wasn't just Hellenistic stylistic influences that made their way into Buddhist art, but also Greco-Roman symbolism and motifs. A very interesting depiction of this influence can be seen in the Brahminian Requiem, the oldest datable representation of the Buddha in human form. A naturalistic depiction of the Buddha is seen standing under a Greek-style column. It is also notable how on either side of the Buddha there are two Hindu deities, with Brahma on the right and Indra on the left. It's really quite fascinating to see this legendary figure so central to Indian culture, standing under a Greek column with Hindu deities standing on either side of it. It really just goes to show just how much the ancient world was connected with one another. We often think of ancient civilizations as being very isolated, but in reality, they were constantly interacting, whether it was through war or trade. This constant mingling of cultures is exactly how we have practically all human depictions of the Buddha today. The Gandharian culture was the birthplace of humanoid portraits of the Buddha, and this influence can be seen in any culture where Buddhism has spread, simply through the fact that there is a representational rendition of the Buddha. So when you think of art in the Buddhist tradition, no matter which pictorial representation of the Buddha you think of, it all stemmed from the amalgamation of Greek and Indian culture. Thank you for listening.